thing. That's probably, I didn't even think about that.
I just love her. Saying hello to her.
Oh, good. Okay. So we'll be,
I gotta go. I gotta go down.
we'll be small then today. Okay, let us pray. If you have the handout, there's a short prayer on top. This is a prayer from Howard Thurman. You don't know who Howard Thurman is? He was a sort of a mid-20th century African-American theologian and civil rights activist. He was actually Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentor, but I don't think he died till the 90s. But hello, welcome. So let us pray. We spread before Thee, our Father, all of the mounting concerns of our lives, and even as we do, so we are not sure of what Thou canst do about them. We ask nothing. We wait, our Father, until at last something of Thy strength becomes our strength, something of Thy heart becomes our heart, something of Thy forgiveness becomes our forgiveness. But we wait, O God, we wait. Okay, so we haven't met for 2 weeks because we had other things happening, and I was actually gone one of those days too. But I would have loved to have spent more time with Luke, but we're going to go to John because that's where we're at in our reading. I think that's a good way to do it. And we'll do John at least next week too. So today I want to just kind of look at John and what his audience is and who he's responding to. So one of the first things, and if you've been doing the reading, you'll have noticed this. One of the first things we should say about John, the fourth gospel, is that whereas in the other gospels, especially in Mark, it's actually kind of hidden who Jesus is. So like we have to have he has to emerge in the story, right? And we don't find out that he's God incarnate, the Son of God for a long time in the story, right? In John, it's there immediately. In fact, he tells us about every couple of verses, if he can, right? It's just he's up on the rooftops screaming it. This is the Christ. This is the Messiah, right? We don't have to have these, the famous story with Peter where Jesus asked the 12, "Who am I?" And they say, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. And then he says, well, who do you think that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, right? I need those kinds of stories in John, because John's telling us all the time, right? We're going to talk about one of these next week. If you just came in, there's a handout up on the table there. We'll talk about this next week, but one of the things John has is these 7 I am statements, where Jesus says, I am, right? I am, which of course is a word play on the Old Testament where God from the burning bush says, I am who I am. So in John, Jesus is just clearly identified as he's God somehow, right? In fact, there's only 2 times in the whole gospel in which Jesus' identity is questioned. In chapter 7, verse 20, someone says Jesus is demon possessed, and in chapter 8 we read that he's a Samaritan, but then of course those things are quickly rebutted, right? So, John is just really clearly telling us this is who Jesus is. So he approaches the story in a different way, and his narrative is different. We'll talk about this a bit too next week, but when does Jesus get angry in the temple and throw the tables over and whip people and these kinds of things, or at least chase after them?
Chapter 2.
In John, it's chapter 2. It's right at the beginning of his ministry. In fact, if you pay attention to it and read kind of carefully, John's got that early, and John also has Jesus making 3 trips down to Jerusalem. So it seems to take 3 years. That's where we get the idea of Jesus doing it for 3 years. Where in the other ones, it all seems to happen in a year. And that scene of Jesus flipping the tables over is actually only a week or 2 before he's killed. So John is okay with sort of changing the timeline because he wants us to tell us a story about who Jesus is, and he's not so concerned about being historically accurate as the other Gospels seem to be, right? And we're going to get into some of John's features. So he actually doesn't start matching the order of the other Gospels until we get to the end. And there he begins to. When we get to the Passion Week and what happens there, all of a sudden, his Gospel lines up almost perfectly with the other three, which I think tells us just how important that story was to the early church. Right. So that's just some things worth pointing out. Why did John write his gospel? So right at the end of chapter 20, there's 21 chapters, and this is the first quote I have on the first page after the prayer. He explicitly tells us, here's why I wrote this book. He says, now then, Jesus also worked many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these signs have been written in this book so that y'all, it's a you plural, who are hearing and are those of us who are hearing and or reading this book might continue believing that Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ, the Son of God, and so that by being believers, y'all will have a life by means of his name, right? So he's telling us, why am I writing this? If you're reading it, you're already interested in Jesus. Perhaps you're part of a church community. This is here to help you keep believing, right? So there's a problem. The community is probably being persecuted in some part. So we've actually talked about this with some of the other ones, but John's community in particular, right, if you read it, there's this strong animosity towards the Jews. In fact, there's this group of people called the Jews who are the enemy. Well, of course, again, Jesus is a Jew. All of his followers are Jews, right? So what we're seeing is, again, this is probably being written down a generation or two afterwards. We've got a group of Christians who were meeting in the synagogues, and they've finally been kicked out. The other Jews are saying, you're not part of us because you follow this Jesus guy. Yep.
I know you saw you wrote, whoever wrote this down.
Right.
Is it a consensus at all that it was John?
We don't know about any of the Gospels. Like, the titles aren't there.
Jesus in his life.
Right, but it doesn't actually ever say anywhere in there that this is written by John, right? We just call this the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John, and traditionally assign them to these authors. So personally, I think it's better to think of it as these are major early church leaders who probably really were the historical persons of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in various ways, their communities record the stories that they're telling. So with Matthew and John in particular, I think these probably are the disciples. They've got communities, right? And when they die, those communities write down their stories about Jesus. Mark and Luke Mark is probably a follower of Peter. He's probably a disciple of Peter, and Luke of Paul. And when Peter and Paul die, they write down the stories that they wrote, right? But we don't really know, right? So yeah. So it's worth pointing out, like John just tells us, why am I writing this? He's writing it so that we will believe and continue in our belief. Yep.
In that verse that you were just reading, I noticed the word signs. And I've been noticing this, we've been reading John, that signs keep coming up.
Yep.
This is the first sign, this is the second sign, and so on. And I believe I remember you talking about, maybe it was in Matthew, but one of the synoptic gospels, you said they don't use signs.
Yep. They use miracles. John uses the word signs, right? And this is kind of getting a little bit ahead of my own notes, but John, the division of the book is actually really easy. It's got really only got two major parts. It's got a beginning and an end. Those are like an introduction and conclusion. Then it's got what we call the book of signs, which is 1:19 through 12:50. Well, that's where we get Jesus doing miracles. He does these big 7 signs, right? And then we have the book of glory, which is from 13:1 to the end of chapter 20. And this is where he is teaching his followers. So even think of that structure, how it's different from the other gospels. The other ones have miracles and teachings and time with his disciples all intermixed. John just kind of says, well, here I'm going to talk about all the things Jesus did, first half of the book. Second half, we'll talk about Jesus' teaching to his disciples, and then, of course, his death and resurrection. Right? It's a very simple structure. It's also really simple to read. So for seminary students, this is the first thing we give them after they've taken their first year of Greek. It's schoolboy Greek. It's very simple. It's relatively free of errors, but it's written at like a 7th grade reading level, right? It's easy, right? And we actually give it to students so they can feel confident. Look, I took a year of Greek and I can read it, right? Because the vocabulary is simple, the grammar is simple, right? So it's simple in terms of language, it's simple in terms of structure. It's also super complicated because John does some fun things in terms of being an artist or a writer. He loves double meanings. So here's what this is in John 12, which I have on there. And you see I've put in a word, doxa. So if you were to go pick up your Bible that you have at home, or the Bible in the pews, every time it says doxa here, it gets translated glory. So it would say, Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him, right? That's one possible meaning of the word. It also means opinion or reputation. So someone's opinion of you, your reputation, is also this word. Word just has 2 meanings, right? But he's doing a wordplay here, right? So if you read this John 12 passage, right? What he's doing here is saying, if you follow Jesus, you care about God's glory. If you don't, you care about human reputation. So he's constantly got this sort of wordplay. And John is also creating 2 camps. There's those who follow Jesus, they're the children of the light, and there's those who don't, they're the children of darkness, right? Which, again, John isn't trying to create enemies, he's rather reflecting on the fact that his community has been kicked out of the synagogues. And they're the real God people because they're following Jesus. When we read this 2,000 years afterwards, and Christianity is now huge, we're in the majority, this good and evil, light and darkness language can become pretty dangerous pretty quick. We need to remember that its context is a small, persecuted group, right? They're not trying to kill the people who are in the dark because they're really small anyway, right? So I think we need to be careful of those kinds of things. But John loves double meanings. I'll do this with John chapter 3. So if you look at, we're going to come back to this if we have time. But here's where we get this a really fun word play. So you all know John chapter 3, right? John 3:16 is the verse I can count on everybody knowing, right? But John chapter 3 is this story of, right, Jesus is talking with Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, right? He's part of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. He's interested in Jesus. So he comes to Jesus by night. He's being sneaky, right? There's already, John loves themes of light and darkness. So the very fact that Nicodemus is coming to Jesus late at night, right? Nicodemus isn't necessarily a good figure. We think that he is. But he does some other things in the story that are show that he isn't entirely on Jesus' side. One thing he does at the very end, he's the one who has Jesus' body anointed, and I don't remember the exact number, because of course it gives it to us in old measurements. But it says he basically brings 100 pounds of perfume to anoint Jesus' body. He's basically saying, stay dead. Stay really dead. It isn't a positive thing. It's actually a negative thing, right?
I thought one of the interesting things Troy said this morning was that when Nicodemus came to Jesus at night, it was interesting to him that Jesus was awake at night.
Yeah, well, that's that too. I mean, Jesus is probably up praying, but you all know this passage because this is where we get born again language. Problem is, everybody who uses that language has missed a joke. This is actually really, really funny if you understand what's going on in this story. So, if you look at verse 3, Jesus answers, so in verse 2, Nicodemus says, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these things that you do unless God is with them. Jesus answers, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born anew, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus says, how can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? Right? So a Greek word translated again or anew is anothen, and it's got two meanings. Right? It can mean anew, like again, kind of a way, but it can also mean from above. And the wordplay here, the way the story is working, it's a whole lot like that old Abbott and Costello skit, Who's on First? They're talking past each other. The problem is, it's really hard to capture in English, because it's the same word in Greek, but for us to get it in English, we have to translate it, and it doesn't work, right? But Jesus is telling Nicodemus, you need to be born from above, from a God. He uses this word, kanothen. That's one of its meanings, born from above. But Nicodemus hears it as again. So Jesus is saying, you need to be born from above. And Nicodemus goes, what? Am I supposed to crawl back into my mom and be born again? And Jesus just goes, no. I mean, and it's actually this really fun wordplay back and forth. But again, it's almost impossible for our Bible translations to capture it if you want to use the same word, English word, to translate the Greek word, right? Because a joke doesn't work in English. So actually the NRSV, which is our Pew Bible, goes with anew for all of them. If you read something like the NIV or the King James, it's going to say born again. But in a sense, both of those are wrong, because it's not capturing that. Jesus is using one meaning of the word, and Nicodemus is using a different meaning of the word. And that's what makes this hilarious, right? They're talking past each other, right? John does this all the time, right? He's playing on the fact that words have different meanings, right? And again, that's hard for us to capture, right? The other thing that's helpful in John chapter 3, it's Jesus and Nicodemus are having this conversation, right? So if two people are talking to each other, and one of them, in this is, it's Jesus as kind of a pastor talking to Nicodemus, who's having something of a spiritual crisis. So put yourself in this situation. What pronouns would you expect Jesus to use when he's talking? What? Well, he was about himself, but yeah, I and you, right? I and you. And this is where English again gives us a little bit of trouble. It's one other person. It's Jesus and Nicodemus. So it should be you, singular, which most languages have a you singular and a you plural, right? That's what happens here. It's Jesus and Nicodemus talking back and forth. It's I and you, singular. But then all of a sudden in verse 11, it changes to a you plural. Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we've seen, but y'all don't receive our testimony. Again, I hate y'all, but I don't know what else to say. Use guys, I guess, right? If I told use guys earthly things and y'all don't believe, how can y'all believe if I so? But what's happened, right? What we're getting is a little. It's the fourth wall's been broken. This little, we've got a little kind of pulling out of a story where we've actually left the time of Jesus, and we fast forwarded 30, 40, 50 years into when John's actually writing his gospel, and his community is arguing with these other Jews, and they're saying, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we've seen, right? We're doing what we're doing because we're following Jesus. We've had this experience of him. But you guys, you haven't received our testimony. If I have told all of you people over here, right, earthly things, and all of you don't believe, how can you all believe if I tell you heavenly things? So he's actually, what's happened is we popped out. And John's community is saying to the other Jews, you guys are the ones who don't believe faithfully. We're the real Jews. Because we follow Jesus. And then he pops us back into the story, right?
Why don't our translations stick to that? Do they just don't trust us to see nuances? I
think that's part of it.
NIV,
right.
It's still talking about, I have spoken to you.
But think about the fact that technically that's proper English. Because English does not have a you plural. Or doesn't, we don't distinguish between a you singular and a you plural. We use the same word for both.
Your translation is we speak.
Yep.
And this says I.
But I don't know why, I don't know why they've done. I looked at this right out of the Greek, so that's what it says, right? It's a we. It pops, it changes, right? And English translations are often trying to put things in good English, right? And rather than sort of, occasionally you do get some translations that don't, and then they sound terrible. They're wooden, they don't read easily, right? And so there's always this sort of a balance, right? The best thing we can do is try to read as many translations as we can to sort of capture, like, what's the nuance here, right? Or you can go spend 3 or 4 years trying to learn the Greek, but, easier said than done. But again, that's just, what's that? Well, yeah, but, so that's just, again, one thing that's worth pointing out. What I really want to do is spend time on John chapter 9. So I've put the whole chapter here on the back of the handout. On the very bottom of the page 2, I've given you a quote from a scholar that explains why I want to look at chapter 9. He says this: a short chapter expresses more vividly and completely than any other John's conception of the work of Christ, right? So we're going to unpack some of this. So what's going on in this story is that there's a man who's been born blind. Jesus is walking along. He sees this guy who's born blind. Jesus heals this guy, and I think this story again helps us understand why John is doing what he's doing and writing this book, right? So there's 2 major elements in this story. We get the miracle or the sign. Jesus heals the blind guy. Again, I think it's worth pointing out, John wants us to tell the story of Jesus in this first half of his book by looking at these major signs. He gives us a whole chapter on this story. The other Gospels would have done it in a couple of verses. They just said, look, Jesus healed this guy, and moved on. John's going to tell us a big, long story, right? No, you're okay. You guys are talking to Tina. I get it, right? So we get this miracle, the sign, and then we have Jesus say later on, "I'm the light of the world." So again, he's telling us his identity, right? So we get this story. There's no real parallel to this story either in the other Gospels. Yes, Jesus heals people, but it's not this exact story. The first thing we should note is Jesus takes the initiative. He sees the guy and walks over and heals him. The guy doesn't ask Jesus to heal him, right? This is important because why does Jesus get himself into trouble here in this story, if you know this story?
On the Sabbath.
He heals on the Sabbath, right? So Jesus takes on all the guilt for this. The other guy doesn't ask to be healed, so he's not to blame. Jesus does it, right? So Jesus alone is on the hook here, right? This is a guy who's been born blind, right? So there's this whole deep debate about like who sinned, him or his parents. Well, how could he be responsible for how he's born and these kinds of things, right? But Jesus kind of puts that to the side. The real thing going on here, the sort of what drives the plot is the fact that Jesus has healed this blind man on the Sabbath, because it creates a tension. If Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and the way he heals isn't just by saying, poof, you're healed. He has to make mud and rub it in the guy's eyes, right? Well, that's a work, right? So he's working on a Sabbath, which is why they're upset. So Jesus heals on the Sabbath, does work, therefore he must be a sinner. But, this is the tension, a sinner can't perform such a miracle. Right, this is the dilemma of the story. It's there in the story, right? Of the Pharisees and these people are investigating. They talk to Jesus. They interview the guy who's been healed. They interview his parents, right? And how does it end? Right? So his parents, right? They get called in, right? And they end up saying, let's look at the part I've got bolded, 13 through 23. So this guy's been healed. The report gets back to the Pharisees, and it was the Sabbath. So the Pharisees ask him how he received his sight. He tells them, "You put mud in my eyes. I washed, and now I can see." And again, look what happens. The Pharisees say, "This man is not from God because he does not observe the Sabbath." Others say, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such a sign?" So that's the tension that's there. They're divided. They ask the guy, "What do you say about him?" He says he's a prophet, right? That's the category he puts him in. The Jews didn't believe that he'd been blind. Again, this whole language of the Jews is weird, right? Because if we say this is a witness report happening, about 29 or 30 AD in the time of Jesus, everybody in the story is a Jew. So what's this category of the Jews? It's the Jews and us, right? It's not a religious or an ethnic distinction that exists in Jesus' time. It exists later. When you've got we'll call them the Orthodox Jews, kick the Christians who are also Jews who are following Jesus out of the synagogue. That's the only way to really make a sense of this. So again, it's an anachronistic term to throw it back into the past, right? It would be hard to come up with an alternative example, but it would be like telling a story about the past and using the name for our contemporary enemy to name people 30 or 40 years ago, before the conflict existed. Does that make sense? So this is what's happening, right? So the Jews, they don't believe. So we're already getting these things cast on them. They're the people who don't believe. They don't believe he'd been born blind, right? And they don't believe he'd received his sight until they call the parents of the man who'd received a sight. And they say, is this your son who was born blind? How then does he see? Look how his parents answer. We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. The parents say, we don't want to get involved in this. Ask him. We didn't do anything, right? His parents said this. Why? Because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him, right? Again, this seems to be that this story, right, if you look above, again, above what I have in bold, Jesus tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, right, which is in Jerusalem.
And Arkansas.
And there's one in Arkansas too, okay, right, but it's in Jerusalem. It's a pool, and you can go there and travel. It actually still has water in it. It's a place you can go visit. But there wouldn't be a synagogue in Jerusalem at Jesus' time, because you don't need one. The temple's there. I mean, if you're outside of Jerusalem, like 30 or 40 miles away, in a village somewhere, like where Jesus grew up, there would be a synagogue, because you're not going to travel 40 miles by foot every weekend, right? But you don't need one in John's time, right? So again, we've got this pop out. We've popped out of the time of the story into the present of when John is writing the gospel, and he's saying there are people who are afraid to confess Jesus because they're scared of being persecuted by the other Jews.
So this is kind of a shunning.
Well, yeah, but it's again, the important part is the story of Jesus is being told. Again, it's 30 or 40 years earlier, but it's being told to address a contemporary concern. Right? This is an example I've used a couple of times, but if someone in 2024 writes a biography of Abraham Lincoln, right, they're not doing it just to tell the story of Abraham Lincoln. They think that by talking about Lincoln today, we're going to speak to our current political concerns. You should follow Lincoln, and therefore your policies should be X, Y, Z, right? Same thing's happening here. The story of Jesus is being told to address a contemporary concern, right? And so, again, the idea is there are people who want to follow Jesus, but they're scared to do it publicly because they're scared of being persecuted, right?
And children in worship, when the third and fourth graders hear this part, they are incredulous.
Yeah.
Fascinated. They are involved in the story.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, because it is a powerful story, right? And for the kids, it's like, why aren't the parents sticking up for them? We're told in the story they're scared of the Jews, right? They're scared of the authorities, right? And there's probably, again, in John's time, this is really what's happening. There's division. The people who are following Jesus are a minority. They're being cast out of the synagogue by the other Jews, right? So they asked this blind man again, and what do they say? Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answers, I don't know whether he's a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He says, I've already told you, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples? I mean, there's a tinge here, right? And again, if we pull this out and say this is what's happening in the present, it's kind of a way of of John's community saying, why do you keep harassing us about this? Do you want to become one of us? Right? And so then they revile him. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And he answers, here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. I mean, the word play here and the metaphor, it is not subtle at all, right? It's you're all here claiming to be experts and to know everything, and you don't even know where this guy's from, but he opened my eyes. I mean, this is all, metaphors for having a knowledge, right? My eyes are open, yours are closed. I can see, you're blind, right? We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. And ever since the world began, has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you are born entirely in sins, and you are going to teach us. And they drove him out, right? They don't have an answer for him, so they kick him out, right? And then we get the real sort of punchy part. Jesus heard what had happened. He finds him and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. Right? Again, it's this. This would be a good play or a TV show, right? It's revealed in this.
You can see Shakespeare.
Right, kind of thing, right? And he says, Lord, I believe. So he calls him a Lord, right? He worships him, right? Again, there isn't anything hidden here. Jesus is just clearly being identified as God. Jesus says, I came into this world for a judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have a sin, but now that you say we see, your sin remains, right? I can see why you don't it's all this indirect, kind of hidden in a way, but it's this word play, right? We're supposed to sort of get out of just this story and sort of think on this bigger plane, right? And again, what we're being told is anybody who doesn't follow Jesus is somehow blind, right? I think this is also why this makes us uncomfortable. It's harsh. I think it helps a bit to put it in its context and see the people who are saying this are in a very small minority who are being persecuted, and there's power when you're in that spot of standing up and saying, we've got the truth. It's a very different thing when you're in the majority and you're powerful and you're saying, we have the truth, and we're going to persecute then the other side. That's the part that doesn't happen here, right? They don't have any power to persecute anyone. So this is my kind of aside, right? When this text is written in the first couple of hundred years of Christian history, Christianity is small. It's persecuted, right? It doesn't have power. This stuff is helpful to hear. We've got the truth. God is with us. We're going to assist when we're oppressed and persecuted, right? I mean, this is a text for a church that's being attacked and that feels attacked, right? It's not for a church when it's huge and it has power. In fact, it's the majority that can potentially persecute others, right? And that's what we did with these passages often in church history. We turned them, right? If the Jews are the enemy, Look at the whole European history of putting Jews in, ghettos or worse. That's what drives this. But that only works if you tear it out of its context. Right? Questions at this point?
The line that says, "Surely we are not blind."
Are we?
It reminds me that maybe they were blind to their own sin
Yep.
and the world, really,
Yep.
at that time. So, I think there's something to that, even relative to Christ's sermon today.
Yeah. I haven't heard the sermon yet, so. Another quick example. This isn't on the handout. It's just another quick example. So this is in chapter 5. Jesus is again debating with Pharisees or the Jews. And this is what he says to them, right? You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that testify on my behalf, yet you refuse to come to me to have life. I mean, to me, that's like one of the punchiest things Jesus says to the Pharisees. He says, you guys spend all your time studying the Bible, the scriptures. You search them for what God wants from you. And then he goes, and everything that they talk about is me, but you don't follow me, so you're blind. Right? I mean, it really is a way of a small group saying to the majority, you think you have the truth. You're the furthest thing from the truth. And you've got the truth right before you, and all you give us is a distorted version of the truth. Dale.
Back in chapter 9, when the Jewish leaders called the blind man in, and you spent some time on this, but this is like verse 30.
Yep.
He's responding. He says, and you read this, now this is remarkable.
Yep.
This has an excellent
Right.
argument. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he's opened my eyes. Now, the next 2 or 3 verses seems to me to be a very rational argument.
Yep.
Number 1, we know that God does not listen to sinners. That's our major premise.
Yep.
We can all agree on that. He listens to the godly person who does his will.
Yep.
So there's the major premise. And nobody's ever heard of this opening his eyes. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. It's
Right.
a very
Yep, it's a logical argument.
And so I'm wondering if John is saying, here's a sign, and you can reason from the sign.
I think that's what he's
to a
doing.
conclusion.
Yep.
And here's a path of reasoning that shows.
Yep. And so, I mean, again, that's what he's doing. But he's saying, like, it appears that Jesus has broken the law. Because the Pharisees can say, he can't be from God because God told us don't do any work on the Sabbath. He's doing work on the Sabbath. Therefore, he isn't from God. And the counter is, but who else can do the kind of stuff he's doing?
Yeah.
So maybe we've got it wrong. And that's actually what it ought to do, is it pushes us back to see maybe we misunderstood what the Bible was teaching us about the Sabbath.
Well, the way you just said that is, you go back to the major premise. What is your major premise?
Yeah.
He must be a sinner because he heals on the
Yep.
Sabbath, or he must be a godly man because he heals.
Yep.
These are the premises or the assumptions that they hold, and whatever is your major premise
Yep.
or your assumption is going to determine the outcome. So
Yep.
that's I like the way you turn that.
So actually, this is how we'll end, because I know some of you need to go, and I want to go to the church service. Part of what we're seeing in John, or what John makes clear, is the actual way how the Christian community comes into existence early on. We've got a group of people who are following Jesus, right? And then he dies, and everything falls apart. I mean, they're in absolute crisis, right? Even after he comes back for 40 days. We get to Acts chapter 1, and he's gone now again, and they're still hiding out. They're in absolute a crisis, right? Everything's fallen apart. They don't know what to do. And then all these things start happening, and it causes them not to lose their faith, but they have to reevaluate everything, right? So when, what happens in Acts, Peter preaches a sermon in chapter 2 after all this happens, right? And he basically tells the whole Old Testament story, but it's now recast as if it was all pointing to Jesus all along. Right? That's what happens, right? And it isn't really clear to them until after Jesus dies and raises from the dead. There's a whole bunch of passages towards the end of John where they basically say, and the disciples didn't understand this until afterwards, after Jesus had raised from the dead and ascended into heaven. Then they were thinking about what he was saying, and they finally understood it, right? So this is part of this message, right? And all the Gospels do this in different ways, but like Mark, for example, clearly has them, they're just dumb, right? They don't get it at all. But they do by the end, right? And as we get these other 3 Gospels, which are being written later, in a certain sense, they have to be made to look smarter because they're now the leaders of the church, right? We have to sort of say they finally did get it in the end. They didn't get it when they were with Jesus, but they got it afterwards when Jesus really revealed who he is by doing what? Rising from the dead.
So the rising from the dead is the thing that
flips. Yes.
It's the metanoia.
Right. Yep. It's a turning of the mind, right? And again, that's one thing we need to just keep, when we're reading these texts, keep it in our mind. Yes, they're telling the story of what Jesus did before the resurrection, but they're telling it from the point of view of the resurrection that's already happened. Right? So yes, it could very well be an eyewitness account, but it's, if I could, time travel back to the Civil War and record it and tell the story, I would still be watching battles happen and watching the politics happen from the point of view of, I know how this is going to turn out. Right? So I would tell the story in a certain way, where that would be different if I didn't. Right?
I remember my mother always said, why in the world did we do this on the 7th?
Yeah.
Why did we wait till Monday?
Yeah.
As to cause the problem.
Well, I think that is part of what he's doing. I think Jesus did do these things intentionally. It was a way of drawing attention to, hey, you guys don't have this right. So, in a certain way, that's not a bad way of putting it. So. We're over time, so.